Well, the psalmist declares, "This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." So I invite you to take a deep breath with me. I need a deep breath. We've been running hard today, but we are so glad you are here with us today. It's my honor to introduce to you Steve Preston, President and CEO of Goodwill Industries International. I've known Steve for 25 years when he served as the CFO and EVP of the Service Master Company, which was then based in Downers Grove, Illinois. Steve would be the first to tell you that the last 2.5 decades have been a wild ride. While CFO and EVP of Service Master, Steve navigated the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which was enacted in the wake of the Enron, Tyco, WorldCom, and high-profile accounting scandals. The act created strict new rules for corporate officers, adding criminal penalties for violating securities laws. So many of you are old enough to remember that and how intense that time was. Then transitioning from Service Master, Steve was asked by President George W. Bush to lead the Small Business Administration, which made critical loans to home and business owners in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And you remember the challenge of Katrina and all that happened in responding and not responding in the aftermath. With the lowest morale when Steve took over of the 31 largest departments in the federal government, SBA, the Small Business Administration, won the award for the most improved morale. With broad-scale success leading SBA, President Bush, during the global financial crisis of 2008, nominated Steve to join his cabinet as the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. With subprime mortgages at the center of the crisis, HUD's work, managing mortgage insurance, community development, disaster assistance, and homeless programs, was vitally important for domestic and global recovery. Between 2000 and 2019, Steve served as CEO, EVP, and vice chairman of 4 major corporations before responding to a call to lead Goodwill Industries International. For the past 3 years, Steve has led Goodwill, the leading provider of workforce training and development in North America, with over 1 million served annually and 125,000 employees. And much of Steve's leadership at Goodwill has taken place during the global pandemic. So again, I say a wild ride indeed. Along the way, Steve has learned something about leading through crises, and he has learned to do it with vision, empathy, and care, as you'll discover as you listen to Steve. In addition to his 35 years of corporate, government, and nonprofit leadership, Steve has remained deeply invested in his local communities, helping to plant churches and provide economic and educational opportunities. He currently serves on the Partnership for Public Service Board of Directors and the Wheaton College Board of Trustees. Steve is a native of Janesville, Wisconsin. He's fluent, although he said he's got to practice up. He's fluent in German. You can test him on that. He's a political science graduate of Northwestern University. He has an MBA from the University of Chicago. He's married to Molly, with whom he has raised 5 adult children. Please join me in welcoming Steve Preston.
Wow, that's a much better introduction than I would have given myself. Thank you. Thank you all Goodwill shoppers. I hope you guys get out there and donate. I just want you to know I'm modeling Goodwill today, right? Nice pinpoint shirt, jacket. I've got a Ferragamo tie on from Goodwill. So you guys got to know that. It is a real pleasure for me to be in Madison. As John said, I grew up in Janesville, just south of here. I went to Parker High School, for those of you who are natives here. The Madison schools were in my sports conference, so I was up here frequently. I went to wrestling camp at the UW when the UW had 4 NCAA champs. It was a great time. And when I landed yesterday, I just felt this like green and gold warmth surround me as I wondered, could this be the year the Packers do it? And oddly enough, my O's started getting longer. I started craving a bratwurst and a Liney's. And I took great comfort in knowing that no one in this room, unlike where I live now, would ever refer to a large yellow head accoutrement as a cheese hat. So it's good to be here. So today we're going to talk about leadership, and it's a topic that consumes business writers and consultants and podcasts for good reason, right? And after leading several organizations, for me, the hows and the what to dos have become more natural in leadership. They weren't always there, but every day is filled with new situations and new challenges, and some of them are pretty significant. And in those places, I'm called upon to lead every day. And every day, I still evaluate my leadership. When it works, I ask myself why. And when it doesn't ask myself, I ask, what could I do differently? And I do that because every day it really matters. Leaders determine the health and the ethos of organizations, the strategy, the standards within which they make decisions. These things drive the culture and the performance, and they affect the lives of many people. Leaders have power. They have power over resources. They have power over people. They have power over networks. And at this moment in history, all of us can understand that. Consider leaders of major organizations during the last 2 years of this pandemic and what they've been called upon to do. Consider nonprofit leaders today as they're delivering aid to Eastern Europe for Ukrainian refugees and for all the needs that they face. And consider our world leaders over the last couple of years. Today, we're looking at somebody who was a former comedian who had a 28% approval rating, who's now the most visible leader on the world stage, the president of the Ukraine. So today, we're going to talk about leading in crises, where there is urgency and where leadership needs to hit the mark in many ways. Fixing complicated problems, motivating a workforce, saving customers, assuring the public. I have in my own career been close to and actually led through many crises that have been caused by a lot of different factors. Natural disasters, economic meltdowns, operational and technology messes, and most recently the pandemic. And one thing is consistent. It's a crisis because nobody expected it's going to happen. Nobody sees it coming. And in those places, leaders at every level, not just at the top, at every level need to have their heads in the game. They may be called upon to take or to help their organization through a period of deep uncertainty. They may need to take their organization to a completely different place than where it currently is. They will need to make extremely difficult decisions, and they also may face very strong opposition along the way. So who you are in that place and what comes through you as a leader will define you as a leader and the impact you have on your organization and its mission. So I'm going to start by walking through some of the crises that I've encountered in my career, some of which John mentioned, because I think that'll give you a sense of the kinds of crises that can emerge and that many of you may face. And I'm sure in the audience, many of you have probably already faced. Then and I also am happy to take Q&A on any of those situations at the end. But I'd also like to do a deeper dive on a particular challenge I faced that was brought upon by an external crisis, and then give you some insight into leading in that specific situation. And then finally, we'll take a couple of steps back and we'll talk about the role of principles and morality in crises. Because in many times, crises are of our own making. And it's often because I believe leaders can lack a sense of true north in leading an organization through a period of time that actually results in a crisis. And that's an important counterbalance to what we're talking about. So I started my career on Wall Street. I was a newly minted 25-year MBA in investment banking. The older people in the room will know I say Wall Street instead of Lehman Brothers because Lehman Brothers doesn't sound so good anymore. Everybody over 45 were the people that laughed, but many of you know that. I was super excited about landing that job. It was sort of the plum job. I was excited about the work I'd be doing, about the caliber of the people I'd be learning from and working with. I had this sense of kind of reverence for the firm and its leaders, and corporate leaders at the time held the top Wall Street firms in very high regard. But not long after I joined the firm, a major insider trading scandal was uncovered, and it engulfed a number of the blue chip firms on Wall Street. And one of our most talented young bankers, somebody who actually interviewed me, was walked out in handcuffs. Lives were destroyed. The industry was badly tarnished. There was a loss of trust among our clients, and that truly was the bedrock of the business, client trust. Number of years later, in the early 2000s, corporate America was embroiled in a far-reaching crisis of integrity and confidence. It became clear at that time that accounting standards had undergone a lengthy period of decline, allowing corporations to report results that inflated their true earnings and hid many of the risks and liabilities that they faced. And as the truth began to emerge, we saw major corporations like WorldCom and Enron imploding, and stock prices plummeted. Employee savings were depleted. People went to jail, and perhaps certainly one of the top accounting firms at the time, if not the top, Arthur Andersen, effectively disintegrated under allegations of misconduct. Congress intervened. They passed much stronger accounting regulations in legislation called Sarbanes-Oxley. And although the accounting industry in many ways had been complicit, they now were called upon to help fix the problem. And they responded in force fully by becoming much more rigid in their audits. I was the CFO of a Fortune 500 company at the time, and because Arthur Andersen was actually our accounting firm, I needed to transition the company to a new accounting firm that would actually have to conduct a grueling 3-year re-audit, looking back on our financial results and questioning all of our historical decisions, which were very public. The SEC at the same time came in and said that they wanted to do a review of the company. And all of this happened with the knowledge of investors that they would have to wait several months to find out what would happen at the end. So a tremendous amount of pressure and a big issue for the future of the company. A few years later, in 2005, our country faced the greatest natural disaster in recent history, which was the destruction of New Orleans and the Gulf after Hurricane Katrina. And a critical part of the federal recovery was the Small Business Administration Disaster Loan Program. And that program provides funds for both individuals and small businesses who are trying to rebuild their homes and their businesses. And because of the unprecedented demand for federal loans, the operations for making those loans had basically collapsed. They just couldn't get them out the door. So nearly a year after the storm, almost none of that funding had been delivered. And that stalled people, it stalled communities from rebuilding. And that's when I was asked to lead the agency. And my mandate was to fix the situation and get funds into people's hands to fuel that recovery. And I'm going to get into that in more detail in a minute. Then in 2008, as the housing crisis was mushrooming into a much larger financial crisis, I stepped in as the housing secretary. Millions of people were facing foreclosures. The financial markets were plummeting. The largest financial institutions in the world were on the brink of failure. HUD's mandate in that place was to protect homeowners, to ensure that people who are having a hard time paying their mortgages could keep their homes, and also in rushing aid to the mortgage market so that new borrowers could get funding they needed to keep to be able to buy homes and keep that market alive, and also in supporting the stability of the entire financial system. Then, when I left Washington, I took over the role as a CEO of a private equity-owned company where the owners had begun to sort of figure out that there were some operational issues. They saw some irregularities. I came in and realized that the core of that the problem was really an existential threat to the company. And I won't get into a lot of detail here because it's messy, but the core of the company was sort of this complex payment and billing system where we had thousands of vendors on one side and thousands of locations on the other side. And we stood in the middle and basically managed the transactions going back and forth. And it became apparent to me that the company was near total collapse because a new IT platform was systematically issuing incorrect bills to the customers and incorrect payments to the vendors, and that's a bad situation. And it was all in the guts of the company. And so it was clear that if we didn't fix it quickly, the customers would abandon us and we really wouldn't have a company. And then finally, 3 years ago, when I took over the helm of Goodwill, we're a $6 billion enterprise, but we're 155 local organizations, separate 501c3. So the Madison region is a unique entity. And 2 years ago, we were in the process of launching this new strategic plan when COVID hit very quickly. 3,300 stores had to close. About 80,000 people were laid off or furloughed. Our workforce development centers closed where people come for help. And my organization was responsible for delivering aid to those organizations so that they could survive financially. And many of them were at risk. So I'll stop with the onslaught of crises, but you can see there've been, maybe it's probably a pattern in my life. So maybe I should think about that in a different way. I don't know. But in crises like these, the stakes are very high. The crisis threatens an organization's mission. It threatens its survival. It affects the lives of many people. And the issues and the solutions are often very complicated, and they're multi-layered. It's not just one thing you got to fix. And they may be driven by external factors outside of your control that may affect your financial condition, your operations, your people, all sorts of things. And so you kind of have to deal with them because it's something going on around you that you have to deal with. The team may be in the state of confusion. They may be panicked. Your team may be unable to act. And external stakeholders that have a vested interest in your organization may turn up the heat very publicly and seek clarity. They may seek decisive action and results, or they may see an opportunity to attack. And to complicate matters, time is of the essence because the need is usually very, very urgent. So in a crisis, in times of great change, people inside the organization especially need clear, decisive leadership that they can trust. They don't always expect all the answers. They don't always expect perfection, but they need to know that their leadership has her or his hands firmly on the wheel, and that the leader is completely committed to the mission, that they're completely committed to the team, that they will advocate what needs to happen as you try to move out of that storm. And I also think it's very important as a leader to speak honestly about the severity of issues and to gain the credibility and trust so that you can do that. And by doing that, focus the attention of the organization on the issues and rally people together for that focusing point. So I'm going to pivot now and talk about the example of the Small Business Administration, where virtually all of these things were at play. As I mentioned earlier, the SBA makes loans to homeowners and small businesses to rebuild after a natural disaster. I came in about 10 months after Hurricane Katrina. 160,000 people and businesses were waiting for disaster loans to come through with virtually no prospect of getting that funding anytime soon. There were deep problems among the employees. John mentioned the agency had the lowest employee morale of the 31 major federal agencies. Public perceptions made the problem worse. Political leaders, the media had heavily criticized the agency. Congressional leaders were calling for my predecessor's resignation, and the press was absolutely unrelenting. In short, disaster victims continued to suffer. Communities were unable to move ahead. Employees were dejected because of their inability to perform, and people lost confidence in our government because we were failing in the mission. So what did we do? Well, you can't make good decisions unless you really commit yourself to listening hard and seeking to understand what the issues are on a very deep level before you act. And in any large, complicated operational challenge, which this was, you really need to dive very deeply into the hard facts. What does the financial information look like? The operational information, the process flows? How do you analyze a situation and build objective premises based on data and information about what's happening? But then it's extremely important to take that data and connect it with what people are experiencing, perhaps people that you're serving, or other people that are affected by your organization. And so in that process, the deep listening begins. And that connects to kind of the stories connect to the data. And so we've delved very deeply into interviews with congressional leaders and local leaders and disaster victims who were actually our loan customers, and sort of what their experience was, so we could connect the dots. And then also, very importantly, with the employees. The employees know what's going on. In a large organization like that, 90% of the answers are somewhere within that employee base. You just have to listen hard and bring them together and pull them out. And so all of this built a picture, and then we needed to do the deep work of designing a solution and implementing it. Okay, so we had sort of the vision, we kind of got the issues, and now we had to say, where do we take this? So to kick it off, armed with all of this information, we planned a 3-day hands-on working session with all of our operational leaders at the front end. We brought in all of those leaders. We brought in facilitators that were armed with all the findings. I committed my involvement to those working sessions, which in Washington is kind of an unusual thing. You know, if you're kind of at the top of the agency level, people think you kind of like, you know, ask everybody else to do stuff. I said, no, I'm going to roll up my sleeves. I'm going to be in the room. And that meant a lot to the team. And before we got down to work, though, with all that stuff, I realized I also needed to address the deep cultural issues we had, which very much related to this low employee morale issue. And I think cultural health is especially important in a service organization where you have people serving people all the time. That connection point needs to work. And I would say that the constant public criticism combined with the internal confusion, combined with a lack of direction at the top, had created this terrible sort of infighting blame game. People were stuck. They were driven by the internal battles, and we needed to look outward, not inward. We needed to look at serving others, not at our self-interest. So before the event, we had a cameraman, and I said, look, can you just go to the Gulf, go down to New Orleans, go down to Mississippi, and capture people telling their stories, people who needed SBA loans. I want to hear their stories about their need, about the impact of those loans. And he came back, and I said, did you get anything good? And he's like, all I had to do was turn the camera on and ask people to talk. It was so powerful. So we brought the group together, and I said to the group, before we begin these working sessions, I want you to hear from the people we serve. And so we turned out the lights. We watched the video. We listened to people's stories. We had a woman who ran a daycare center and said, when I get my daycare center up, people will be able to go back to work. But nobody was working at this. Very few people were working because the destruction was so extensive. We had a guy that used whose taxi had been destroyed, who was using a loan to get his taxi. He said, you know, most of my business is helping old people get medications and go to the doctor, and I haven't been able to serve them. And we started to realize how the need was affected by our work. And so when the lights came on, the room was quiet, and I said, look, everyone gets a free pass on the past. But going forward, the battle is out there, and all of our conversations need to be focused on helping people get their lives back. And I will tell you, it is amazing how often a higher calling is buried by problems, buried by smallness, and buried by self-interest. And it's the leader's job in those situations, I believe, to lift the sights of an organization to a higher place. People want to be part of something great. They want to win. They want to rise to the occasion if they're given the chance. And it's the leader's job to facilitate that and create an environment where they can do that. The core of our problem, as I mentioned before, was a deeply broken operational process. Without getting into a lot of detail, effectively there was like an assembly line that all the loans would go through, and you'd get mortgage documents and legal certifications and financial reviews. And basically what happened, what we realized was the process was riddled with errors. There was little visibility into where the problems occurred along the process, and these loans would get to the end of the process, and a quality control person would say, this is wrong, I'm going to send it back to the beginning of the line. The disaster victims, who are our borrowers, had no visibility into the process. Their loan documents were often lost. They'd call a call center. People wouldn't know what the status was. And here they were without a home and no answers. And so through the work we did, we eliminated this production line concept altogether, and we completely designed the process into teams. case management teams were people from different areas, legal, finance, documentation review. They all worked collaboratively on a team supporting each other. And their goal was to get those loans over the line with high quality. And the teams actually ensured higher quality, better customer care, better visibility into the problems because they were talking about them in much quicker action. Every borrower was assigned to a team. Every borrower had a phone number that wasn't an 800 call center. It was this phone number to a case agent who knew their issue, could support them, knew when they needed that loan by, and could mobilize the team to act. The case managers were trained to listen with a caring ear, decipher problems, and find solutions. They were given production goals. We had contests. We, injected kind of some energy that way. And we kicked off the process at the beginning by calling 160,000 people who didn't have their loans and asking them, where are you? What do you need? What is your timeline? Help us understand how to help you. And it changed. It changed everything. On top of that, we needed to execute the plan with a high degree of rigor. You can't just kind of do it and let it happen. You've got to stay very close to the operation. We had very detailed action plans, very detailed program management of the changes, constant tracking, constant monitoring, constant course correcting where we were off. And we physically moved 2,000 people to redesign those process flows. And we listened along that process very hard to our clients to see how we were doing. And the interesting thing was those case managers that we assigned to the customers or the disaster victims became our best source of information for what was working, because every day we were getting feedback from the field, and it allowed us to get better every day. And then finally, we advanced a very robust communication plan. We needed the public to understand that things were changing because the perspective was so dark and so negative. We needed to give people transparency into how it was changing and the impact of those changing. So our communication faced outward to the borrowers, giving them very detailed information of where they were in the process, to political leaders to give them confidence that we were moving in the right direction, to the media, and very importantly, back to our employees, who needed to have the sense that what they were doing mattered again. It was critical to rebuilding faith. It demonstrated that a change had happened by showing real results, and it supported the team in many ways by showing them my willingness to be public and to tell the story about how the team was performing in a very different environment. Within 6 weeks of the new process, production doubled, and within a few months, we had $6 billion into people's hands, rebuilding the communities and people's lives. And the most exciting thing was the team had been viewed as being the problem. And after this, it was that same team that drove the solution. For me as a leader, there's nothing better than that. All right, that's where the excitement comes in. Now, the crisis at the SBA was driven by an external event. The event was unavoidable, but it was matched by an internal inability to respond to the situation. And so those two things needed to come together. However, as I mentioned earlier, a number of crises I described in my opening remarks, I believe were actually caused by people, and more specifically by leadership, and I believe even the moral failings of people. And I want to pause on this because I think an important adjunct to any discussion of leading through crisis is leading in a way that averts crisis. And leadership in those places can come in big and small forms. It's riddled throughout the organization. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into two of the ones I just mentioned. Earlier, I mentioned a crisis related to the integrity of financial reporting in the early 2000s, the Sarbanes-Oxley bill that came out of that. During that period of time, we'd had a very long bull market, and stocks had been going up for some period of time, and there was a lot of pressure out there for companies to keep the results coming, to keep the stock markets, to keep their stock prices strong. Bankers were making a tremendous amount of money on advisory and underwriting fees. At the same time, within these banks, there were equity analysts. These were people whose job it was to analyze companies and recommend them to investors if they were good, and maybe put a negative rating if they didn't think it was a great investment. Those people started working with the bankers closely, and as a result, the equity analysts were very involved in driving fee business, and in many cases, people believed that their objectivity kind of went away, and they were compensated more for deals than they were in some way for the quality of their analysis. which created a real conflict of interest and compromised the integrity of their research. There was also tremendous pressure on management teams to deliver strong results to keep their prices high. And they were also incentivized to do so because their own wealth was dependent upon their company's share price. Accountants whose audit services were supposed to ensure financial integrity to those financial reports were increasingly incentivized to sell other lucrative consulting firms to the clients that they were auditing. And many people believe that this created a conflict of interest and was perhaps a factor in the decline of their audit work. I can tell you personally, as being a corporate leader in the finance area, about speaking with these equity analysts. I'll never forget, somebody at a major firm called me up to say, hey, look, if your company's results are kind of below expectation, will you kind of be able to make it work? Do you have enough kind of in your accounting reserves to manage the reporting situation? I can tell you other situations where I saw operating leaders kind of blaming the accountants because the numbers weren't strong enough, rather than saying, well, maybe the operating results aren't strong enough. It was ever present in the industry, and I saw it firsthand. And ultimately, the impact of the entire system was enormous and lasting, which you heard in just a minute ago. Now, when you look at the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, I think we saw another abdication of leadership and another ethical breach that nearly caused the failure of the entire financial system and led to a major recession. Congress had passed, and many of you in this audience, especially the older ones, will realize what a frightening period that was in our history. Congress, as a result, had passed legislation to set aside about $750 billion, which was meant to stabilize financial institutions if they needed it. And as HUD secretary, I sat on sort of the 5-person board of that organization. Many of you will remember the acronym TARP. That was the TARP board. And I sat with the Secretary of Treasury and the Federal Reserve Chair and 2 others, and we were the ones who saw the needs from the financial institutions come in and then actually invested funds in them. During that time, one institution after another came to us with urgent requests for capital. And I have to tell you, I will never forget the day that the Treasury Secretary came to the table and said, Citibank needs equities to survive. It was a remarkable time. Now, when we look back, people like to vilify one group or another when they look at what caused the crisis. They especially like to blame the bankers because they're the easy target. But I'll tell you, in this situation, I think there was culpability riddled throughout the system. The housing market had been extremely hot for a long period of time, and there were huge incentives to keep it going. Mortgage originators, the people who make the mortgages, were paid based on the number of loans that they made out. They made increasingly risky loans to borrowers who clearly couldn't afford them. And then they sold those loans and effectively dumped the risk on other people. Home buyers were purchasing homes with these mortgages that they really couldn't afford. In many cases, they didn't understand it because of the way the mortgages were designed. Financial firms bought those mortgages from the originators. They packaged them in mortgage bonds, and then they sold them to investors for a fee, keeping little of the risk themselves. So they moved it on. In many cases throughout the crisis, it became apparent that many of these institutions became increasingly aware of the poor value of those loans, but continued anyway. Rating agencies, whose job it was to help investors make good decisions by publishing risk ratings, put very high investment ratings on these bonds without doing sufficient rigorous work to really understand what was in them. And at the end of the line, there were the buyers who invested in securities. I believe that lawmakers knowingly allowed a bad system to continue with poor regulatory oversight and misguided incentives. And it was everywhere. It was all through the food chain. It wasn't one person. It wasn't one institution. It was systemic. People lost trillions of dollars, millions of jobs, and millions of homes were lost. Now, in both cases, there were many different types of actors. There were many specific institutions with leaders at all levels continuing the behaviors that perpetuated the problem. And I think that if the strength of leadership had broken the chain in any one of those places forcefully, the advance of the problem would have been curtailed. But it wasn't. And the world suffered because of it. Now, I think that forces that conspire for good or evil, or conspire for success or failure, that affect entire societies are both driven by and mitigated by individual people making individual decisions, but providing good leadership or not. And after these blowups, in the cold light of day, in the rearview mirror, it's very easy to say, like, how could this happen, right? It was so clear where the problems were. It's clear to me now that I'm telling you 10 or 15 years later, right? Where were people's values? Where were their consciences? Where was their sense of true north, right? I don't want to imply that every one of these institutions was intentionally committing fraud or knowingly taking advantage of people, although I think there was some of that. But I think on a wider scale, something much sneakier was at play. Few people go from being anchored in doing the right thing to doing the wrong thing in one fell swoop. We're usually not confronted with something bad and we say, yeah, we're going to make a decision to do that. I think it often happens through a slow erosion of principles. It's often imperceptible. The crowd migrates slowly and gradually, and it's often because of a lack of leadership, a lack of keeping that sense of true north in front of people, that the crowd or the team continues to move. The decline of accounting standards during the Sarbanes-Oxley period happened over many years. I can remember as a Lehman banker, talking through the standards of how equity analysts and bankers were always separate. They didn't talk, like these were the rules. And then over time, a lot of things changed. In the mortgage market before, 2004, we saw like good credit standards. Things were done kind of the right way. And it was over those intervening 3 or 4 years that the whole world began to migrate to a different place. And so I want to share with you a metaphor that was an experience of mine to make this point. When I was younger, I was an avid windsurfer. And it was one October, I met up with a group of people to sail from Cape Cod. I don't know if any of you kind of know the Massachusetts area, but Cape Cod's on the mainland. And we were sailing to an island called Martha's Vineyard in October. And we were going to sort of go through this body of water, which was a few miles long. And for those of you who have spent time in New England, in the autumn, conditions can be unpredictable and challenging. So we took off on our windsurfers. It was clear that it was going to be a very challenging day. The sky was gray, the wind was strong, it was cold, the waters were choppy. And after crossing most of the sound, I found myself just a couple hundred yards offshore. I was just about there and sort of thought, oh, great, the destination's there. But things changed very quickly because I had an equipment failure. And the line popped off of my mast and my sail collapsed. And that left me with nothing to capture the wind or propel me to my goal. And at that point, the wind had become much more erratic. The chop had grown to like 3 or 4 feet, so I had water splashing over me, and I was unable to re-rig the sail in the water because of the conditions around me. So I began signaling for help, but I wasn't too nervous because I could see the beach. I could see Martha's Vineyard, which is large, and that sort of was for me, a point of comfort. I could see where I was going, but what I realized is that actually my perspective was flawed because of a slow drift. In the distance to the east of me, I began to hear this faint sound of a bell that was in a bell buoy ringing. I didn't pay much attention at first, but then slowly the sound became louder, and within a short period of time, I had drifted to the buoy itself. And before I knew it, that bell ringing was moving to the west of me. And what was happened was a very strong current that I barely noticed because I was looking at this big beach was taking me out to Nantucket Sound and beyond, which was beyond where anybody would have found me. Before I had the fixed reference point of the bell buoy, I had no idea how much that current was pulling me, how far I had drifted, and how alarmed I really should have been. And it took that immovable standard of the bell buoy to show me just how far I had moved and to show me that I had really drifted from solid ground very far. And I'll save the rescue story for later if you want to hear it. But anyway, both of these massive systemic crises were based on a drift in the wrong direction over a number of years. In one case, it was the gradual erosion of the integrity of corporate financial statements that investors and our markets relied on to make investment decisions. In another case, it was the gradual erosion of lending and financial standards that caused the worst economic meltdown since the Depression in the 1930s. I believe that each one of us may find drifts in our own lives or in our own organizations in smaller and more nuanced ways. And in so many times, larger crises are averted because good leaders have taken a stand, because they've done the right thing, because they've seen that drift and they've stood tall when others were willing not to stand tall, because they held fast to what they believed was right. And I believe that these are the places that we all are called upon consistently to be people of principle, irrespective of where we sit in an organization. Each of us is called to engage in various circumstances every day and to lead in our own ways within our organizations or where we live. And I believe each one of us needs to have conscious, intentional principles for what we believe is right and how we engage, how we lead, how we live our lives that are bedrocked. And in doing so, I think we all have to ask ourselves, what is at the core of what we believe? How does it define how we will live our lives? What are the specific principles that guide us in these situations, ethically, relationally, and otherwise? And how do they affect our behaviors, specifically when they're put to the test? Because how we ensure that we will not drift past the bell buoy in areas that we're likely to confront will be really important to doing the right thing. And it's so important because the current can be imperceptible, and at the same time, the current can be very strong.